Many people are willing to help and truly want to do good in this world. Those who act best in such situations are those who have experienced hardship and deprivation themselves and are now being challenged. However, not everyone wants to help. If you face such a person and try with all your might to help them, you can cause enormous harm, even with fatal consequences. Yet as today's story shows, sometimes the consequences are tragic for the helper themselves. Tammy Epperson was an attractive woman who had worked in the modeling industry for many years. She ended her work in that field a few years before the events in question. Her career failure was due to her addiction to certain substances, and she spent her entire life in Los Angeles's disadvantaged neighborhood known as Skid Row, unable to resist temptation. By the age of 30, she was addicted to illegal substances. Fortunately, Tammy recognized her situation and did not want to accept it, so she decided to complete a rehabilitation program. By 2000, she had managed to change her life completely. At that point, the woman was 38 years old. Despite her long struggle with addiction, she took advantage of her second chance. Tammy pulled herself together and broke the cycle. By the time of the events in question, she had fully overcome her addiction, had begun living again, and decided to help others so they too would have the chance to turn their lives around. Tammy lived in Burlington Plaza, a publicly funded housing complex built to give people a fresh start, those who had only just begun fighting their addictions, and those who had already managed to overcome them. For many, it was a true fortress, separating those who suffered from the crime that thrived outside the complex walls. There was a fence and round-the-clock security. Before entering, every visitor had to sign a special register, and when leaving, they were also logged. Unfortunately, none of these measures were sufficient for Tammy. She lived in a small apartment on the ground floor, but an intruder attacked her inside the building. It was a brutal crime, a prime example of extreme violence that was shocking even for Skid Row. When police investigators arrived at the building on the 13th of November, 2000, around 9 p.m., they saw that the walls and floor were covered in blood. The intruder had been so violent that blood was literally everywhere, even on the ceiling. For many police officers, this case stood out as the most striking manifestation of human cruelty, something that would remain etched in their minds for the rest of their lives. At the crime scene, investigators found a complete wreck. In the small 10 by -12-meter apartment, everything that could be broken had been destroyed: furniture, glass and ceramic items, household appliances. Everything lay smashed and scattered on the floor. All of these objects were also covered in blood. Tammy's belongings were scattered around the bed, as though the intruder had been searching for something specific. The officers suspected he might have been looking for money or illegal substances. The massacre's victim lay in a pool of blood on the floor. She was partially undressed, her underwear pulled down, and her face badly disfigured. The insides of her thighs and her groin area were torn and lacerated. Because of her posture, the injuries, and the missing clothing, investigators assumed she could have been a victim of rape. From the very first seconds at the scene, the officers had an eerie feeling. Several medical examiners working in the building could not endure the horrifying sight. There was blood everywhere, and the condition of the body was appalling. Due to the small space and the attacker's unbelievable brutality, blood spatter covered every surface. According to police, the perpetrator attacked the 38-year-old woman, slamming her against the wall several times. She instantly suffered severe injuries that would have left her disoriented or even unconscious. Unfortunately, that did not seem to satisfy the attacker, who continued beating her long after Tammy was already on the floor, using whatever came to hand. It was clear that a significant amount of time passed during this brutal massacre. The unknown assailant initially struck down the resident of the apartment, then methodically searched everything, tossing and shattering items all around. However, at the time of the attack, not one neighbor called the police. According to investigators, the state of the corpse's decomposition suggested that Tammy had died at least 24 hours before the police arrived. Yet every neighbor claimed they had heard nothing, which was clearly a lie because the apartments were not soundproof, and the scale of destruction was too great to go unnoticed. In reality, A close friend of the victim did file a report with the police. He did not know what had happened to the woman, but after being unable to reach her for several hours and hearing from a third party that Tammy was probably dead, he went to the authorities. It turned out that the police had no information about the incident, but they found the man's statement compelling enough to dispatch a patrol to check if everything was all right in her apartment. Even a quick examination of the body showed that the assailant had exhibited extremely violent behavior. He obviously had a strong reason for this aggression, or held a long-standing grudge, because Tammy had been slaughtered with horrifying brutality. Her once attractive face was so disfigured it was unrecognizable. One of her eyes had been gouged out, and her throat had been slashed multiple times with glass shards. She was hit in the face at least 3 times with what was probably a large screwdriver that the police found under her shoulder. The puncture wounds were deep and round, indicating that this was the weapon used. One of the investigators immediately suggested that the attacker's motive might have been the woman's beauty. Tammy was, in fact, very attractive. It seemed someone wanted to destroy that beauty, and the perpetrator succeeded. All the blows focused on the victim's face and neck. These were deep stab and slash wounds that left her no chance of surviving the brutal assault. A blood spatter specialist was summoned to the scene. In these circumstances, he analyzed the apartment's horrifying condition and reconstructed the events as accurately as possible. He spent 7 hours collecting data in the victim's apartment and piecing it together into a complete picture of the crime scene, followed by several more hours of continuous analysis to gather, process, and systematize the evidence. Numerous traces of blood were found in the bathroom, while the body was in the living room. The victim was probably attacked while she was in the bathroom. Several bloody marks that could have been made when the victim's bloody head was pressed against the wall were discovered. There were multiple similar impressions at different heights, as if someone had strangled her and lifted her from the floor. Also, the bathroom door was closed at the time of the attack, as indicated by the blood droplets on the inside of the door. A trail of blood led from the bathroom to the living room, suggesting the assailant carried the victim's body in his arms into the living room, letting the blood drip downward. Tammy was then laid on the floor, and the torture continued. Apparently, it was then that she received deep stab wounds with the screwdriver and cuts to her throat, which eventually led to her death. The forensic team had a lot of work to do, because the assailant used multiple murder weapons. He not only stabbed the victim in the face with a screwdriver, but also used glass shards found in the room to slash her throat. Several pieces of furniture, including a wooden chair leg, also looked suspicious. Everything was covered in blood and left at the crime scene, meaning it might contain valuable evidence and DNA material to help identify the ruthless murderer. All this material was collected and sent to the lab for thorough examination. It was assumed that the attacker had injured himself during such a bloodbath, so the medical examiners hoped to find his blood as well. Among the household items used by the intruder was an ottoman, which investigators initially could not identify. It was literally smashed into small pieces but appeared to be covered in blood. An unidentified glass object, initially believed by the investigators to be a lamp, was in a similar condition. The lab, however, determined it was actually a heavy flower vase. That decorative item had apparently been broken into several parts, each bearing numerous bloodstains. These shards looked as though they had been used to slash the victim's throat and strike her. Forensic experts believe the attacker broke all these objects on his victim, as she lay unconscious in the middle of the room. This fiend took one object after another, striking Tammy until the object was completely shattered, then picking up the next one and repeating the process. The most striking aspect was that the building's residents completely ignored the accompanying commotion. Investigators found out that the attacker had smashed, one after the other, a candlestick in the bathroom, then an ottoman, a vase, and finally a lamp, which had the most blood on it. While inspecting the victim's small apartment, officers found several valuable pieces of evidence. In the bathroom sink lay a bloody rag likely containing traces of the attacker's blood. As it turned out later, it bore Tammy's DNA. indicating that the killer had tried to clean up the blood. Once he realized the extent of the mess and how long it might take to deal with it, he left everything as it was and fled. A water bottle with a red fingerprint was also discovered. In the trash were numerous paper towels bearing similar prints. In addition to the beating, Tammy had been raped, as her underwear and clothing were pulled down. These suspicions were confirmed by the medical examiner, who found blood in the victim's intimate areas that indicated contact with the attacker after the blows had been inflicted. The medical examiner took a swab from the body to determine the suspect's DNA. Given the nature of the attack, police immediately began searching for enemies in Tammy's immediate circle. In her apartment, they found several items that she apparently considered precious and had framed, but no photos of family members, friends, or men, just pictures of her modeling work, a training certificate, and a confirmation of her participation in a rehab program. Tammy was clearly proud of these things. The apartment was neat, clean, and tidy, decorated with angels and flowers. It did not look like the typical home of someone struggling with substance abuse or living a life close to the underworld. Based on what people said, both from her personal circle and elsewhere, Tammy really had overcome her addiction and was leading a normal life. However, she still had suspicious individuals in her environment who struggled with substance abuse. A few years earlier, Tammy herself was in a tough criminal milieu, but she managed not only to overcome her addiction to illegal substances, she also found a fairly respectable job. She became an office manager for a Hollywood telephone service that dealt with celebrities. In addition, she volunteered at a church near her residential complex, helping people with addiction problems. Tammy agreed to do this because she saw it as a way to help those in need. Since the attacker had aimed to destroy her beauty, and she was a very attractive woman, the police suspected the perpetrator might be a spurned lover or a secret admirer who had never declared himself to Tammy. Almost immediately, the investigators got a lead on a possible suspect. One of the complex's residents, who wished to remain anonymous, told them about the alleged killer. The first suspect's name was Ronald Sims, or simply Ron. The man had been seriously addicted to illegal substances for a long time and continued to struggle with them. He had also been involved with Tammy romantically for some time. Their relationship ended when she managed to overcome her cravings, while Ron was never able to break the cycle, though they remained on friendly terms and stayed in contact, as Tammy believed Ron needed her help. She would advise him and set a good example. The police immediately reached out to Ron as a potential killer, but he denied any guilt. He claimed he was friends with Tammy. They had never argued, and he would not have harmed her. Instead, Ron told a darker story. He maintained that he had stayed in contact with Tammy not just to deal with his own problems, but also to protect her. Apparently, during the counseling sessions at the church, Tammy met a suspicious man who soon began stalking her. Because of that man, Ron started supporting her. The man's name was Troy Powell. At the time of Tammy's death, he was 32 years old and on probation after a recent stint in prison. It turned out that all three, Tammy, Ron, and Troy, were friends, moved in the same circles, and attended the same church. However, Troy claimed to have been in love with Tammy from the moment they met. He would see her after work, bringing flowers and teddy bears. Nearly every day, he waited for her in his pickup truck in front of the church and offered her a ride. At that time, there was a bus driver strike in the city, and sometimes Tammy accepted Troy's offer, though she usually preferred to get a ride with someone else. Troy suffered from an addiction, and the deceased felt he was potentially dangerous, so she rarely accepted his help. She had more than once confided in her ex, Ron, that she only agreed to ride with Troy in emergencies, considering it less risky than walking the dangerous streets of one of the city's most crime-ridden neighborhoods. Her agreement, however, was misunderstood by Troy, who became increasingly convinced that he had a chance at a romantic relationship with Tammy. In reality, she was forced into accepting his help because of her circumstances, and also genuinely wanted to help him face his problems. She gave him advice and tried to support him while still clearly keeping her distance, as she did not want any kind of romantic involvement. Tammy repeatedly made it clear to him, but Troy became ever more persistent. Lately, Troy's obsession had worsened, and Tammy started avoiding him. Her relatives said he might have been involved in her murder. Troy was known to be jealous, aggressive, and deeply obsessed with Tammy, making him a potential suspect in the eyes of the police and those who knew about his involvement with her. In Tammy's apartment, the officers found a disturbing piece of evidence, an address book, in which she recorded all the calls from this suspicious man. There were countless notes indicating when Troy called, how long the call lasted, and what the outcome was, including whether there were threats or similar incidents. Most of these notes ended with Tammy asking Troy not to bother her anymore, but he kept calling, sometimes the very same day, and over a long period. The situation escalated when one of Troy's acquaintances informed Ron that the suspect had admitted killing her. When Ron heard this, he immediately called the police and reported Troy's confession. According to the witness, Troy said he had gone to see Tammy. They had a pleasant time, then had sex, but an argument broke out, and in his rage, he killed her. Despite the detailed account, police were not convinced Ron was telling the whole truth and took him into custody for clarification. Ron initially remained on the suspect list because he was a criminal with a prior theft conviction and a possible motive jealousy of an ex-girlfriend. However, he was later released due to lack of evidence. Meanwhile, Troy could not be found. He vanished in a city of 4 million people. It was believed he had gone on the run, having gotten a few hours head start. A review of Burlington Plaza's logbook showed that Troy had indeed entered the building on the day of the murder and left several hours later. When he exited, he was asked about Tammy, because residents were not permitted to leave the building unaccompanied. Troy smiled and told security that Tammy was resting. This answer was enough for the guards, and they let him go. Troy was the last person to visit Tammy's apartment, further heightening suspicion. Ron stated that, on the same day, he and Tammy had arranged to go to work at the church, but when he tried calling her, she did not pick up. This struck him as strange, because she always enjoyed talking to him on the phone. The church noted that Tammy had not shown up. The next morning, Ron went to see her at work, but she was not there either. Ron, who had relapsed into using illegal substances, could not get into the housing complex, but he noticed that Troy's red pickup truck was parked outside, which worried him. Ron kept calling Tammy persistently, but she never answered, so he turned to the police. Investigators gradually pieced together what had likely happened on that fateful day. In their view, Troy picked up Tammy from church the evening before the murder, and they stopped at a shop to buy a Bible, which Tammy gave Troy, believing he was finally on the road to recovery. Possibly he talked her into letting him come over, perhaps on the pretext of needing help with his addiction. Tammy's close friends claimed she would not give him another chance, but she was somewhat naive, so maybe he just convinced her he needed guidance and advice in dealing with his drug problems. She was a kind person who believed she could help make the world a better place, and probably could not say no, allowing him into her apartment. Tragically, she trusted people around her who were far from perfect. Investigators checked Troy Powell's criminal record and found a long list of offenses, including serious crimes such as using and distributing illegal substances, burglary, and rape. He had already served time for an attack on another woman he had also stalked. She survived his assault by some miracle. He was clearly a danger to society, especially to women. Troy was very masculine, muscular, and tall, the kind of tough guy who might attract women. The police initiated a search for his vehicle, the red pickup, which Ron was able to describe in detail, as he had often seen Troy with Tammy in that truck. The day after investigators first arrived at the massacre scene, they received a tip. Troy had been spotted at a friend's house in San Pedro, about 30 kilometers away, apparently hiding there from another man who was also on probation. The police rushed to the address. They learned Troy had left his pickup behind and run off about 45 minutes earlier. Since the suspect was no longer using his vehicle, he could have vanished into the city's crowds. However, the following morning, the officers got lucky. The pickup was removed during the night, and one of the patrol officers who regularly checked the local probation office spotted an unfamiliar vehicle in the parking lot, a conspicuous red pickup. The officer ran the license plate and confirmed it was Troy's. The investigators were notified and arrived on scene to arrest the main suspect. They staked out the vehicle, waiting for the killer to come retrieve it. A big, brawny man eventually appeared as the driver. The most suspicious thing was his baseball cap, on which the investigators found blood drops. However, the man in custody gave his name as Charles Varney, and after checking his documents, it turned out he was telling the truth. Still, the police decided to detain him and test the red stains on his cap. He said that his friend Troy had given him the truck the previous day and taken off during the night, along with his jacket, camera, and other possessions. Indeed, the two had been cellmates, remaining in contact after their release. Officers immediately searched the motel room, finding a film in the camera. After it was developed, photos showed Tammy with Charles and Troy. Charles said they had all met at the church where Tammy helped people with addiction problems. Unfortunately, the DNA test took much longer, but it was ultimately revealed that the blood on the baseball cap did not belong to the murder victim. Charles was questioned again and eventually admitted having important information, but he was willing to share it only in exchange for protection from prosecution. The officers agreed. According to the criminal, Troy had admitted murdering his so-called beloved, who never returned his feelings. He gave Charles his pickup truck and fled from the police. At the same time, his former cellmate said the killer was open to the possibility of surrendering voluntarily. Charles insisted he had nothing to do with the crime, but during questioning, he mentioned details that only the perpetrator or a direct witness could know. He was aware that Tammy's throat had been slashed and that she had been stabbed multiple times in the face with a screwdriver. It was unclear whether Troy told him these details or Charles was present at the scene. Regardless, Charles was forced to cooperate with the investigation and revealed that Troy had called him that same day at 7 p.m. The man agreed to help the police capture the murderer. The two buddies spoke by phone, allowing the police to track down the address where the criminal was hiding. Troy was arrested at his motel while he was watching an adult film. Tammy's keys to her office were found there. Troy intended to burglarize it. His DNA was found on the deceased's body following the rape, and numerous bloody fingerprints were discovered on many objects. The victim's blood was also on his clothing, so there was no doubt Troy was guilty. In Troy's confession, he admitted to killing Tammy, but claimed to have been in poor mental health. He said he suffered from mental disorders and had not been taking his prescribed medication for a long time because he had no money to buy it. He claimed he went to see Tammy. They had consensual sex because they were in a relationship, and later Tammy got a phone call from another man. This infuriated Troy, and Tammy refused to talk with him about it and simply went to the bathroom. Troy followed her, locked the door, and punched her multiple times in the head. He claimed he remembered nothing after that. By this time, the analysis of the collected evidence had been completed. All the fingerprints belonged to Troy. The forensic scientists now suspected the crime involved not just rape and beatings but also torture. Troy was charged with premeditated murder, burglary, rape, and torture. Taken together, these charges were strong enough for the prosecution to seek the death penalty. Troy, however, was not ready to give up so easily. He insisted he had a lifelong mental disorder that rendered him unfit to stand trial, so the hearing had to be postponed pending psychiatric evaluation. That evaluation concluded the killer had not been out of his mind during the attack. He had detailed the sequence of events to his friend Charles, who became one of the prosecution's main witnesses. Troy himself cited childhood trauma as the reason for the attack. He claimed he had suffered cruelty from an alcoholic father throughout his youth, leading to abnormalities that made him unable to handle Tammy's rejection without flying into a rage and losing control. All of this was supported by a psychiatrist. One of the most significant parts of the hearing was Troy's own testimony as a defense witness. Normally, such appearances are disadvantageous to the defendant, but Troy was familiar with the legal system, so his story sounded fairly coherent. He admitted he might have been the murderer, but asserted that he could not remember anything. At the same time, he believed the woman was still alive when he left the apartment, so he claimed the killing was unintentional. Troy also denied having any issues with women, contrary to what his psychiatrist described. On Troy's side were his mother and 2 sisters, all of whom testified that he had physically attacked them before, causing serious injury. He had even broken his mother's spine and, years before, pushed his sister down the stairs, then claimed memory loss. Nevertheless, his family continued to insist he was a good person, incapable of such brutality. The forensic evidence, however, said otherwise. One of the most horrifying statements from the prosecutor was that Troy had tortured his victim for a considerable time before she died. Medical examiners noted tears in the victim's perineum. According to experts, these were the worst mutilations they had ever seen in their careers, indicating a prolonged, savage beating rather than any consensual intimacy. The jury found Troy Powell guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution on death row at San Quentin Prison. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.